Welcome to Bedtime Biographies. A night, we trace the arc of a man whose decisions are currently rewriting the code of human civilization. From a childhood in St. Louis to the high-stakes boardroom of the world's most powerful AI lab, this is the definitive account of a relentless architect of the future. Bedtime Biographies presents Sam Altman, From Silicon Valley Dropout to AI Visionary. Written by Jamie Glick. I am your narrator, Christopher. Our journey spans 10 chapters, from the first spark of a tech prodigy in the American Midwest to the global explosion of ChatGPT and the resilience required to survive a Silicon Valley coup. We begin in 1985 with a young boy and his first computer. Chapter 1. A tech prodigy awakens in the Midwest, 1985 to 2003. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over St. Louis, Missouri in the early morning hours, a stillness that belongs entirely to the American heartland, where the Mississippi River moves slowly and deliberately, and the sky stretches wide and unhurried above flat, generous land. It is the kind of place where people build things carefully, where ambition is tempered by practicality, and where the ordinary rhythms of life, school, family, seasons, seem to hold the world in place. It is here, in this city of bridges and riverboats and proud Midwestern steadiness, that Samuel Harris Altman was born on the 22nd of April, 1985. He arrived into a family of educators and professionals, a household where ideas were taken seriously, where reading was not merely encouraged but expected, and where curiosity was treated as one of the most valuable things a person could carry through life. His mother, a dermatologist, and his father, a real estate broker, gave him a home that was warm and intellectually alive, the kind of environment where a child's questions were met not with impatience, but with genuine engagement. From the very beginning, those who knew Sam would later remark that there was something quietly different about him. Not different in the way that made him an outcast, he was personable, likable, easy to be around, but different in the way that certain children simply seem to operate on a frequency that others around them haven't quite tuned into yet. He was the kind of child who didn't just want to know what something did. He wanted to know how it worked, why it worked, and what else it might be capable of doing. The Altman household was comfortable and loving, rooted in the Jewish traditions of a close-knit family, shaped by a sense of community and responsibility. St. Louis in the late 1980s and early 1990s was not Silicon Valley. It was not a place where venture capitalists gathered over coffee to speak of disruption and scale. It was a place where people built lives steadily, block by block, year by year. And yet, even here, the early tremors of the digital revolution were beginning to be felt. When Sam was 8 years old, something happened that would quietly redirect the entire course of his life. It was not a dramatic moment, there was no thunderclap, no sudden vision. It was simply the arrival of a computer, a Macintosh, into the Altman home. To most children of that era, the personal computer was a curiosity, a machine for playing games, perhaps, or for typing up school reports. But to Sam it was something else entirely. It was a window. A portal. A device that seemed to whisper, in its soft mechanical hum, that the world was far larger and far more malleable than anything the view from St. Louis might suggest. He did not simply use the computer. He studied it. He took it apart, metaphorically and perhaps literally, in the way that certain minds simply cannot leave a thing alone until they understand it completely. He learned how it thought, how it processed, how the instructions he gave it shaped what it returned. And in that early relationship between a curious 8-year-old boy and a glowing Macintosh screen, something profound and irreversible was set in motion. The years passed and Sam grew and his obsession deepened. By the time he was a teenager, he was not merely comfortable with technology, he was fluent in it, in the way that some children are fluent in music or mathematics, not because they were taught it rigorously, but because it seemed to speak a language they had somehow always known. He taught himself to code, working through problems with the focused patience of someone who genuinely enjoys the puzzle for its own sake, not merely for the reward at the end. He attended John Burroughs School, a private preparatory school in Ladue, Missouri, a place known for its academic rigor and for producing students who went on to distinguished careers in medicine, law, the arts, and the sciences. The school sat on wide, well-kept grounds, the kind of institution that took intellectual development seriously and expected its students to do the same. Sam thrived there, though perhaps not always in the ways his teachers might have predicted. He was bright, clearly, his grades reflected that, but his most compelling education was happening outside the classroom, in the private hours he devoted to computing, to reading voraciously, and to beginning to understand, however dimly, the shape of the world he wanted to inhabit. It was during these years that Sam Altman began to develop something that would prove perhaps more valuable than any technical skill: the ability to think about the future not as an abstraction, but as a practical problem to be solved. Where other teenagers were thinking about the weekend or the next exam, or the social architecture of high school life, Sam was thinking in longer arcs. He was reading about technology, about business, about the way ideas moved through the world and became things that people used and depended upon. He was beginning to understand, intuitively, that the intersection of technology and human behavior was where the most interesting things were happening, and where the most important things were yet to happen. His social life was not absent. He was not the isolated, room-bound figure of popular imagination, the teenager hunched over a keyboard in the dark, cut off from the world. He was sociable and curious about people, interested in the motivations and ambitions of those around him. But he was also, unmistakably, someone who had already begun to orient himself toward something beyond the immediate horizon, someone who seemed, even at 15 or 16, to be in quiet conversation with a future that others had not yet begun to imagine. He came out as gay during his teenage years, a decision that required a kind of courage that is easy to underestimate from the outside. In the early 2000s, in a Midwestern city in a private school environment, such a declaration carried real weight. But Sam made it without fanfare, and those who knew him spoke of it as entirely consistent with his character: direct, unafraid of the truth, unwilling to construct a life built on concealment. It was, in its own way, an early expression of a quality that would define his professional life as well: a preference for clarity over comfort, for honesty over the easier, softer path. By the time he approached his senior year at John Burroughs, the question of what came next was not, for Sam, a source of anxiety. It was a source of excitement. He applied to Stanford University, that sun-drenched institution in the hills above Palo Alto that had become, by the turn of the millennium, the unofficial beating heart of the technology world. Stanford was not simply a university. It was a geography of possibility. Its alumni had founded companies that were reshaping civilization. Its professors were doing research that existed at the very edge of human knowledge. And its culture, entrepreneurial, restless, optimistic in the particular way that California had always been optimistic, was precisely the culture Sam had been gravitating toward his entire young life. He was accepted, and in the late summer of 2003 he packed his things and left St. Louis. He left the wide, quiet streets, the slow river, the generous Midwestern sky. He left the home where a Macintosh had once changed everything. He drove west, toward California, toward the ocean, toward the sun-bleached campuses where the future was already being assembled, piece by piece, in laboratories and dormitory rooms and late-night conversations between people who believed, with the particular intensity of the young and brilliant, that they were going to change the world. He arrived at Stanford at 18 years old, carrying a lifetime of accumulated curiosity, a mind trained by years of self-directed learning, and an intuition about technology and human potential that was already, in many ways, more sophisticated than that of people twice his age. He did not yet know exactly what he would build or found or lead. He did not yet know the names of the companies, the partnerships, the arguments, the breakthroughs that awaited him. He did not yet know that the road he was on would eventually lead to the most consequential artificial intelligence laboratory in the history of human civilization. But the road had begun. It had begun in St. Louis, in a warm and loving home, with a child and a computer and a question that never stopped asking itself: what else is possible? And now, at 18, standing at the entrance to Stanford University, with the California sun falling golden and warm on everything around him, Sam Altman was precisely where he needed to be, poised, prepared, and absolutely ready for whatever came next. Chapter 2. Stanford Dreams and the Bold Dropout, 2003 to 2005. Stanford University sits in one of the most beautiful places in the world to think. The main quadrangle, with its sandstone archways and red-tiled roofs, catches the California light in a way that feels almost deliberately inspiring, as though the architecture itself was designed to remind you that here, in this place, extraordinary things are expected of you. The palm trees stand tall and unhurried along the wide pathways, and the Santa Cruz Mountains rise gently in the distance, and the air carries that particular quality unique to the San Francisco Peninsula, warm and dry and faintly electric, as though the atmosphere itself is charged with possibility. Sam Altman arrived here in the autumn of 2003, one among thousands of exceptionally talented young people who had worked and studied and dreamed their way to this campus. He was 18 years old, lean and sharp-eyed, already carrying in his manner the quiet confidence of someone who has spent years in private conversation with ideas that most people his age hadn't yet encountered. He enrolled in the computer science program, the natural home for a mind like his, and he settled into the rhythms of undergraduate life with the genuine enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of environment. The Stanford Computer Science Department in 2003 was not merely an academic program. It was a living, breathing ecosystem of ambition. The professors who walked its hallways had, in many cases, shaped the architecture of the modern Internet. The graduate students were working on problems that would become the foundational technologies of the next decade. And the undergraduates, particularly those drawn to computer science, arrived already understanding that their education was not simply preparation for a career. It was preparation for building things that did not yet exist. Sam moved through the campus with the alert attention of someone absorbing everything simultaneously. He attended lectures. He worked through problem sets. He sat in the kinds of late-night conversations that Stanford dormitories are famous for, sprawling, digressive, occasionally brilliant discussions about technology and philosophy and the shape of the future, fueled by coffee and the shared intoxication of being young and capable and surrounded by others who were equally young and equally capable. He was, by all accounts, a natural participant in these conversations. Not the loudest voice in the room but often the most incisive one, the person who had a tendency to cut through the noise and identify the thing that actually mattered. But it was not only the formal curriculum that was educating Sam during these months. It was the culture. Stanford, perhaps more than any other university in America, had by the early 2000s developed a culture that treated entrepreneurship not as an alternative to academic achievement, but as its natural extension. The campus sat at the geographical center of Silicon Valley, and the valley's gravitational pull was felt everywhere. In the guest speakers who came to campus, in the research collaborations between faculty and industry, in the casual conversations at lunch tables and in coffee shops where someone might mention, in passing, that they were working on a startup. The entire environment was saturated with the idea that a student with the right insight and the right timing and the willingness to take a risk could, quite literally, change the world. This was the air Sam Altman breathed every day. And it was doing something to him. It was accelerating a process that had already been underway for years, the gradual sharpening of a question that had been forming in the back of his mind since childhood. Not simply the question of what technology could do, but the larger and more urgent question of what he, Sam Altman specifically, could do with it. What was the thing only he could build? What was the problem that he was uniquely positioned, by temperament and talent and timing, to solve? The answer began to take shape in an unexpected way. Sam had always been deeply interested in the relationship between people and technology, not just the engineering side of things but the human side. How do people move through the world? How do they navigate from one place to another? How does the information they carry in their heads about where they are and where they want to go shape their behavior, their choices, their daily lives? These were questions that sat at the intersection of computer science, psychology, and the emerging world of mobile technology, and in the early 2000s, they were questions that very few people had begun to answer in any satisfying way. The smartphone as we now know it did not yet exist. The iPhone was still 4 years away. But the mobile phone was everywhere, and the idea that a phone could be not merely a communication device but a platform, a tool for navigating reality itself, was beginning to circulate among the more forward-thinking corners of the tech world. Sam was paying attention to these conversations, and something in them was resonating with his own instincts, his own sense of where things were heading. It was during his time at Stanford that Sam began working on the idea that would become Loopt. The concept, in its essence, was location sharing, a service that would allow people to see where their friends were in real time, using the GPS capabilities that were beginning to appear in mobile devices. It sounds almost quaint now, in a world saturated with location-aware applications, but in 2003 and 2004, it was genuinely visionary. It was an attempt to solve a problem that everyone recognized but no one had yet solved. The persistent, low-grade frustration of not knowing where the people in your life actually were, of playing phone tag and sending text messages into the void and arriving at restaurants to find that your friends had already left. Sam worked on this idea with the intensity that would become characteristic of him, systematically, thoughtfully, with the kind of focus that does not burn brightly and briefly but sustains itself over months and years. He began talking to people about it, testing the concept, refining the idea. He found collaborators, people who shared his vision and his willingness to work hard toward something that didn't yet have a guaranteed outcome. And as the idea grew more concrete, something else was growing alongside it. A conviction, still tentative but increasingly insistent, that the right place to build this thing was not inside a classroom. This is the tension that Stanford itself, perhaps inadvertently, creates in its most ambitious students. The university provides the environment and the tools and the networks that make a startup possible. But the startup, once it takes on a life of its own, begins to compete with the university for the one resource that cannot be manufactured or extended: time. And time, Sam was beginning to understand, was the most precious variable of all in the technology world. Being right about an idea matters enormously. But being right at the right moment, arriving in the market when the technology is ready and the cultural appetite is present and the competition has not yet recognized what you've recognized, that is a different thing entirely. That is what separates the companies that define an era from the companies that are remembered only as footnotes. The decision did not come all at once. It developed slowly, through conversations with mentors and collaborators, through long private hours of consideration, through the gradual accumulation of evidence that the moment for Loopt was now. Not in 2 years, not after graduation, but now. Sam was 19 years old. He was 2 years into a 4-year degree at one of the finest universities in the world. And he was seriously contemplating walking away from it. To appreciate how significant this decision was, it helps to understand what Stanford represented to someone from St. Louis, Missouri, to a family that had invested deeply in education as the foundation of a successful life. A Stanford degree was not simply a credential. It was a kind of assurance, a promise that the years of hard work and careful preparation had resulted in something durable and transferable, something that would open doors for decades to come. To leave before completing it was to reject that assurance, to trade the certain value of the degree for the deeply uncertain value of an idea that might or might not work. And yet Sam made the decision. In 2005, after 2 years at Stanford, he left. He did not leave bitterly or impulsively. He left with the methodical deliberateness that characterized everything he did. Having thought it through, having weighed the risks, having concluded that the potential upside of pursuing Loopt immediately outweighed the cost of deferring it. He left with the understanding, shared by a small but growing number of young technologists in Silicon Valley at that time, that in a world moving as fast as the technology world was moving, a 2-year head start could be the difference between building something historic and arriving to find that someone else had already built it. It is worth pausing here to consider what it takes to make a decision like this at 19. Not merely the intellectual confidence, though that was certainly present, but the emotional resilience, the ability to absorb the uncertainty, to sit comfortably with the knowledge that you have chosen a path with no guaranteed outcome, a path that most reasonable people around you would advise against. Sam had that resilience. He had it not because he was reckless, he was never reckless, but because he had done the work of thinking clearly about what he valued and what he believed, and the conclusion of that thinking pointed unambiguously in one direction. He applied to Y Combinator, the startup accelerator that Paul Graham had founded just months earlier in the spring of 2005. Y Combinator was, at that moment, a genuinely new thing in the world. A small, focused program that provided seed funding and mentorship to very early-stage startups, asking in return for a small equity stake and a commitment to work with the ferocity and focus that the program demanded. It was not yet the legendary institution it would become. It was a bet, made by a small group of thoughtful people, that the best way to produce great startups was to identify great founders early and give them the resources and the environment to move quickly. Sam and his co-founders were accepted into Y Combinator's very first batch. It is a fact that, in retrospect, carries a kind of narrative symmetry. Sam Altman, in the first cohort of the institution that would help shape Silicon Valley's next decade, working on an idea that was itself a bet on where technology was going. He was 19 years old. He had left one of the best universities in the world. And he was about to find out whether the conviction that had driven him to that decision was as well-founded as he believed it to be. The Stanford campus, with its sandstone arches and palm-lined paths, receded behind him. The mountains were still there in the distance. The California light was still golden and warm. But Sam Altman was no longer a student moving through someone else's curriculum. He was a founder now, moving through a challenge of his own design, writing his own syllabus in real time, accountable only to the idea he had chosen to pursue and the people who had chosen to pursue it with him. The education, in the deepest sense of the word, was just beginning. Chapter 3. Launching Loopt, the startup Crucible, 2005 to 2011. There is a particular kind of morning that belongs exclusively to the early days of a startup. It arrives before the rest of the world has fully woken up, in a small and cluttered office or a shared apartment workspace where the furniture doesn't quite match and the coffee is always either too strong or not strong enough. It is a morning saturated with equal measures of excitement and anxiety, where the distance between what exists and what you are trying to build feels simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. It is a morning where everything is still possible precisely because nothing has yet been proven, and where the only thing standing between the idea in your head and the reality you are trying to create is the willingness to keep working. This was the morning that Sam Altman woke up to in the summer of 2005. He was 19 years old, freshly departed from Stanford, armed with an idea, a small team, and a place in the inaugural batch of Y Combinator, the scrappy, ambitious new accelerator that Paul Graham had launched with the conviction that the best investments in technology were not made in boardrooms but in the earliest, most uncertain moments of a company's life, when the founders were still young enough to be unreasonable and still hungry enough to be dangerous. Y Combinator's first batch was small and intimate in a way that later cohorts, as the program grew into a global institution, would never quite replicate. There were only 8 companies in that inaugural group, and they worked in close proximity to one another, sharing the particular camaraderie of people who have all made the same improbable bet at roughly the same time. Paul Graham moved among them like a professor who genuinely believed in his students, probing, questioning, pushing, occasionally delivering the kind of blunt and clarifying feedback that only the most useful mentors are willing to give. He had a gift for identifying the precise moment when a founder was confusing themselves with complexity, and for cutting through that complexity to the thing that actually mattered. For Sam and his co-founders, the thing that mattered was Loopt. The concept had sharpened considerably since its earliest articulation. At its core, Loopt was a mobile social networking application built around real-time location sharing. It allowed users to see where their friends were on a map, to discover when someone they knew was nearby, to dissolve the invisible barrier of geographic uncertainty that had always existed between people who were, in theory, connected but in practice operating in complete spatial ignorance of one another. In 2005, with GPS technology becoming more capable and mobile phones becoming more powerful with each passing month, this felt not merely like a good idea but like an inevitable one, the kind of service that, once it existed, people would wonder how they had ever managed without. The work of building it, however, was considerably more demanding than the elegance of the concept might suggest. The technical challenges were real and numerous. Mobile platforms in 2005 were fragmented and inconsistent, a landscape of competing operating systems and hardware configurations that made building a smooth, reliable application across devices an exercise in patience and problem-solving. The GPS capabilities of phones at that time were imprecise and power-hungry, draining batteries quickly and returning location data that was often frustratingly approximate. And the infrastructure required to handle real-time location updates for a large number of simultaneous users was not something that could simply be assembled from off-the-shelf components. It had to be built, tested, refined, broken, and rebuilt again. Sam threw himself into this work with the total commitment that the moment demanded. He was not merely the idea person, the visionary who handed off the difficult technical work to others and focused on the grand narrative. He was in it, deep in the product decisions, the architectural choices, the user experience debates, the endless iteration that is the actual substance of building a software company from nothing. He had the founder's characteristic inability to fully separate himself from the thing he was building, to treat it as a job rather than an extension of his own identity and judgment. The Y Combinator program lasted 3 months, culminating in a demo day, a carefully choreographed event at which the startups in each batch presented their work to an audience of investors, journalists, and technologists who had gathered to see what Paul Graham's experiment had produced. Demo Day was, in its own way, a kind of baptism. It was the moment when the private work of the previous months was exposed to the judgment of the world, when the company stopped being a thing that existed only in the minds of its founders and became a thing that other people could evaluate, criticize, invest in, or ignore. Loopt's presentation on that first Y Combinator Demo Day generated genuine excitement. The idea was clear, the technology worked, and Sam presented it with the composed authority of someone who had thought more carefully about the problem than anyone else in the room. Investors paid attention. Conversations followed. And Loopt emerged from Y Combinator with something that most early-stage startups spend years struggling to obtain: real momentum. The funding came. Not in the enormous quantities that would later become common in Silicon Valley's increasingly extravagant funding environment, but in amounts that were sufficient and meaningful, money that allowed the team to grow, to hire, to move from the improvised workspaces of the early days into offices that felt, however modestly, like the headquarters of a real company. Sequoia Capital, one of the most storied venture firms in Silicon Valley, invested in Loopt. This was significant not merely for the capital it provided but for the signal it sent. When Sequoia invested in a company, the rest of the valley noticed. Sam was 20 years old when Sequoia came on board. He was leading a funded startup, managing a growing team, navigating the complex and often contradictory demands of building a product, satisfying investors, managing employees, and staying ahead of a competitive landscape that was, with each passing month, becoming more crowded. The mobile social space was attracting attention from all directions, from other startups, from established technology companies, from the restless army of engineers and designers and product managers who had recognized the same opportunity that Sam had recognized and were working, with varying degrees of urgency and sophistication, to claim their share of it. The years that followed were the years of the Crucible, that period in a founder's life when the romantic narrative of the startup gives way to the grinding, unglamorous reality of actually running a company. It is the period that separates the people who wanted to be founders from the people who were genuinely built to be founders. The former are drawn by the idea of it, the status, the autonomy, the possibility of extraordinary financial reward. The latter are drawn by the work itself, by the specific, irreplaceable satisfaction of solving hard problems in real time, of building something that didn't exist before and watching it enter the world and find its users. Sam belonged unmistakably to the latter category. He worked with the kind of sustained intensity that is difficult to manufacture and impossible to fake, arriving early, staying late, maintaining the focus of someone who understood that every day brought new problems and that the problems would not wait to be solved at a convenient time. He was developing, through this experience, a set of capabilities that no university curriculum could have provided. He was learning how to hire people, how to identify the rare individuals who combine technical ability with the startup-specific qualities of resilience, adaptability, and genuine commitment. He was learning how to manage, how to give people the direction and resources they needed while also giving them the autonomy that talented people require in order to do their best work. And he was learning how to make decisions under conditions of radical uncertainty, which is perhaps the most important and least teachable skill in the entire vocabulary of leadership. The product itself continued to evolve. Loopt launched on Sprint's network in 2006, becoming one of the first location-sharing applications available to a mass consumer audience. The response was encouraging. Users downloaded it, used it, talked about it. There were moments of genuine traction. Periods when the metrics moved in the right direction, when the user numbers grew and the engagement data suggested that people were incorporating Loopt into their daily lives in meaningful ways. These were the moments that sustained the team through the harder stretches, the periods when growth stalled or the technology misbehaved or the competitive landscape shifted in ways that required the entire strategy to be reconsidered. Because the competitive landscape was shifting, constantly and dramatically. The launch of Apple's iPhone in 2007 was an event that restructured the entire mobile technology industry in the span of a single keynote presentation. Steve Jobs stood on a stage in San Francisco and announced a device that was, in the most literal sense, a new kind of object. Not a phone with some additional features, but a fully realized portable computer that happened to also make phone calls, built around a touchscreen interface that made every previous mobile interaction feel primitive by comparison. The App Store followed in 2008, and with it came an explosion of mobile software development that transformed the context in which Loopt was operating. The iPhone was, in one sense, exactly what Loopt needed, a platform with the processing power and GPS precision and user interface quality to make location sharing work the way Sam had always imagined it could. But it also brought new competitors into the space with a ferocity and speed that required constant adaptation. Foursquare arrived in 2009, bringing a game mechanics approach to location sharing that attracted enormous attention. Google was investing heavily in location-aware services. Facebook, the social networking colossus that was rapidly consuming the attention of the entire internet, was beginning to think seriously about location as a dimension of its platform. Sam navigated this landscape with a strategic clarity that was becoming his defining professional characteristic. He made product decisions, pivoted when the data demanded it, raised additional rounds of funding, expanded the team, contracted it when necessary, and maintained throughout a quality that distinguished him from many of his peers in the founder community. The ability to hold a long-term vision firmly in mind while simultaneously managing the short-term pressures that were constantly threatening to pull attention in every other direction. He was also, during these years, becoming something more than a founder. He was becoming a figure in the broader Silicon Valley ecosystem. A young technologist whose opinions on product development, on startup strategy, on the direction of mobile technology were sought out and respected by people considerably older and more experienced than himself. He was not yet famous in the public sense. But within the particular world of technology and venture capital and startup culture, his name was becoming known. People who met him came away with the impression of someone who thought more clearly and more originally than most, someone whose instincts about where things were going had a quality of reliability that was difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. The 6 years of Loopt were not, in the end, a story of conventional success. The company did not become the defining social platform of its era. It did not achieve the kind of explosive, culture-reshaping growth that transforms a startup into a legend. The location-sharing space proved more difficult to dominate than the early promise had suggested, and by the time the broader market fully embraced location-aware social networking, the landscape had been reshaped by players with resources and distribution advantages that made competition on equal terms impossible. But measured by the standard that actually matters, what did the experience produce in the person who lived it? Loopt was an extraordinary success. It produced a version of Sam Altman who had spent 6 years in the most demanding school that the technology world offers. The school of actually doing it, of hiring and firing, of raising money and spending it wisely, of making decisions in conditions of incomplete information and then living with the consequences of those decisions long enough to understand what they taught, of caring deeply about something that didn't always cooperate, and continuing to care about it anyway. In 2012, Loopt was acquired by Green Dot Corporation for $43 million. A respectable outcome, a validation of the work, a return for the investors who had believed in the idea and the team. The transaction was completed cleanly and professionally, in the manner of someone who understood that the end of one chapter was simply the beginning of the next. Sam Altman walked away from Loopt at 26 years old. He was not wealthy in the way that Silicon Valley's most spectacular outcomes produce wealth. But he was rich in something more durable and more consequential than money. He was rich in understanding, in the accumulated, hard-won knowledge of what it actually takes to build a company from nothing, to lead people through uncertainty, to stay committed to a vision when the world is not cooperating with it. He carried that understanding with him as he stepped away from the company he had spent 6 years building. The Crucible had done its work. And the metal it had produced was considerably stronger, and considerably more refined, than the 19-year-old who had first walked into it with nothing but an idea and the willingness to find out what he was made of. Chapter 4. Rising at Y Combinator partner to president, 2011 to 2014. There is a moment in the life of certain exceptional people when the path they have been traveling, the one they built themselves stone by stone, through years of effort and learning and occasional failure, suddenly reveals itself to be preparation for something larger. Not a detour. Not a consolation. But a deliberate, if unplanned, apprenticeship for a role that could not have been reached any other way. For Sam Altman, that moment arrived in 2011, when Paul Graham invited him to join Y Combinator as a part-time partner. It was, on the surface, a modest transition. Sam was 26 years old, freshly emerged from the Loopt experience, carrying the particular combination of clarity and humility that comes from having built something real and watched it fall short of its highest ambitions. He was not arriving at Y Combinator as a celebrated success story, trailing the mythology of a billion-dollar exit. He was arriving as something more valuable and more rare, a founder who had done the work honestly, who understood from the inside what the experience of building a company actually felt like, and who had the intellectual generosity to want to share that understanding with others who were just beginning their own versions of the same journey. Y Combinator in 2011 was already considerably different from the intimate 8-company experiment of 2005. Paul Graham's bet had paid off with a consistency that had made the accelerator program famous throughout the technology world. The companies that had passed through its program, Airbnb, Dropbox, Reddit, Stripe, among many others, were not merely successful startups. They were reshaping industries, redefining consumer behavior, and generating the kind of returns that transformed Y Combinator from an interesting experiment into one of the most influential institutions in the history of technology entrepreneurship. The program had expanded its cohort sizes, deepened its curriculum, and attracted an increasingly extraordinary pool of applicants from around the world. Into this environment came Sam Altman, quiet and observant, absorbing everything with the same focused attention he had brought to every new environment since childhood. His role as a part-time partner placed him in direct contact with the founders in each batch, young, brilliant, anxious, ambitious people who were wrestling with exactly the kinds of problems Sam had spent 6 years wrestling with himself. He sat with them in office hours, listened to their pitches, challenged their assumptions, and offered the kind of feedback that only someone who has genuinely been where they are can credibly give. What Sam brought to these conversations was something that distinguished him immediately, even among a group of advisors that included some of the most accomplished people in Silicon Valley. It was not merely the content of his advice, though that was invariably thoughtful and precise. It was the quality of his attention. He listened in a way that many people do not waiting for his turn to speak, not organizing his response while the other person was still talking, but genuinely present to what was being said, alert to the thing beneath the thing, the real problem hiding inside the stated problem. Founders who sat across from Sam in those early office hour sessions came away with the sense that they had been truly heard, which is a rarer experience than it should be, and which is among the most powerful things one human being can offer another. He was also developing, in this period, a more systematic understanding of what separated the startups that succeeded from the ones that didn't. He had always had intuitions about this. His time building Loopt had given him a founder's instinctive sense of what mattered and what didn't. But the Y Combinator vantage point was different. It offered something that no individual founder experience could provide: breadth. Sam was now seeing dozens of companies simultaneously, across different industries and different stages of development, built by founders with radically different backgrounds and temperaments and approaches. He was accumulating data at a rate that was simply impossible from inside a single company, and he was doing with that data what he had always done with information: organizing it, finding the patterns, drawing the conclusions that the patterns suggested. The patterns were illuminating. The startups that worked, he observed, tended to share certain qualities that had less to do with the specific market they were in or the specific technology they were building and more to do with the nature of the founders themselves. The best founders were those who combined an almost unreasonable commitment to their vision with a genuine willingness to be wrong, people who held their ideas firmly enough to pursue them through adversity but loosely enough to revise them when the evidence demanded it. They were people who understood that the primary job of an early-stage founder was not to execute a predetermined plan but to discover as rapidly as possible the truth about what their customers actually needed. They were, in a word, learners, people constitutionally oriented toward understanding rather than toward being right. Sam embodied these qualities himself, which made him uniquely capable of recognizing them in others. And as his reputation within Y Combinator grew, as more and more founders sought him out, as his advice proved consistently valuable, as his judgment about which companies were going to work and which were not demonstrated an accuracy that was difficult to explain as anything other than genuine insight, Paul Graham was watching. And Paul Graham was thinking about the future of the institution he had built. The question of succession at Y Combinator was one that Graham had been turning over in his mind for some time. He had created something extraordinary, and he understood, with the clear-eyed practicality that characterized his thinking about almost everything, that extraordinary institutions are fragile when they are too dependent on any single individual. The question was not merely who could run Y Combinator after Graham stepped back. The question was who could take what Graham had built and make it larger, more rigorous, more impactful, who could preserve the essential character of the institution while growing it in ways that Graham himself might not have imagined. The answer, increasingly and unmistakably, was Sam Altman. In 2013, Paul Graham named Sam Altman president of Y Combinator. Sam was 27 years old. He was being handed the leadership of what had become, in the span of less than a decade, the most influential startup accelerator in the world, an institution whose alumni network spanned every major sector of the technology industry, whose demo days attracted the most important investors in Silicon Valley, and whose imprimatur on a young company was widely understood to be among the most valuable signals in the market. The appointment was, by any measure, a remarkable expression of confidence in someone who, only a few years earlier, had been a graduate of Y Combinator himself rather than its leader. Sam accepted the responsibility with the characteristic combination of ambition and seriousness that had defined his approach to every significant challenge in his life. He did not arrive in the role with a preconceived agenda, a fixed vision of what Y Combinator should become that he was simply waiting for the authority to implement. He arrived with questions. He spent the early months of his presidency listening, to the partners, to the alumni, to the founders currently in the program, to the investors who participated in demo days, to the broader technology community that Y Combinator served and influenced. He was building a picture, assembling the data that would allow him to make decisions about direction and strategy that were grounded in genuine understanding rather than inherited assumption. What he found was an institution that was already excellent but that had room to become something more. Y Combinator had been, in its early years, primarily focused on a particular kind of startup. Small, software-oriented companies building consumer or enterprise products, typically founded by technical people in their 20s, primarily based in the United States. This was not a limitation that Graham had imposed deliberately, it was simply the natural shape of the thing as it had grown. But Sam saw, with the breadth of vision that was becoming his signature, that the model could be extended, that the principles underlying Y Combinator's success were not specific to any particular kind of founder or any particular kind of company, but were universal enough to be applied across a much wider range of contexts. He began to expand the program's ambitions. He pushed Y Combinator to think more seriously about companies working on hard scientific and technical problems, not just software but biotechnology, energy, healthcare, manufacturing. He championed the idea that the most important companies of the next several decades would not be the ones optimizing existing digital services but the ones tackling the foundational challenges of civilization. Energy production, human health, the organization of cities, the nature of work itself. This was not a popular position in all corners of Silicon Valley, where the conventional wisdom held that software companies, with their low capital requirements and high margins, were the only sensible targets for venture investment. Sam pushed back against this conventional wisdom with the patient persistence of someone who has thought more carefully about the long arc of technology than most. He also began to think seriously about Y Combinator's role not merely as an investor but as an intellectual institution, a place that generated ideas about technology and entrepreneurship in the future, not just companies. He encouraged the partners to write, to speak, to engage publicly with the big questions that Y Combinator's position at the center of the startup ecosystem gave them a unique vantage point to address. He wanted Y Combinator to be not just the place where great companies started but the place where the most important conversations about technology and society were happening. The growth during his early years as president was significant. The program expanded its cohort sizes, bringing in more founders per batch than ever before while working to preserve the quality of the experience that had made the program legendary. The geographical reach expanded, with founders arriving from an increasingly international pool, from Europe, from Asia, from Latin America, from Africa, bringing with them perspectives and market insights that enriched the intellectual environment of each batch. The alumni network deepened and broadened, becoming a resource of extraordinary value, a community of people who had shared a foundational experience and who remained genuinely connected to one another and to the institution that had helped launch them. Through all of this institutional growth, Sam never lost the quality that had made him valuable as a partner in the first place, the quality of genuine engagement with individual founders. Even as his responsibilities expanded and his time became more constrained, he remained accessible in a way that people in his position often do not. He continued to take meetings, to answer emails, to give the kind of direct and honest feedback that founders needed and that people in positions of authority frequently withheld out of a misguided desire to be universally liked. Sam understood that the most useful thing he could do for a struggling founder was not to offer reassurance but to offer clarity, to help them see their situation accurately, even when accuracy was uncomfortable. He was also, in these years, building a public presence that extended beyond the Y Combinator community. He was writing, producing essays on technology and startups and the nature of ambition and the future of artificial intelligence that circulated widely and generated genuine discussion. He was speaking at conferences, sitting for interviews, participating in the public conversation about where technology was going and what its implications were for society. His voice in these forums was distinctive, not the breathless enthusiasm that often characterized public commentary on Silicon Valley, but something more measured and more interesting, a quality of thinking that held complexity without being paralyzed by it, that acknowledged uncertainty without retreating into vagueness. He was becoming, in other words, not merely a successful operator but a thinker, someone whose views on the largest questions were worth taking seriously, whose perspective on the future had been earned by years of direct engagement with the present. The founder who had left Stanford at 19 to build a location-sharing app had grown, through the alchemical combination of experience and reflection and time, into something considerably more significant. He had grown into a leader, not in the superficial sense of someone who held a title and occupied a large office, but in the deeper sense of someone whose judgment other smart people trusted, whose vision of the future other ambitious people wanted to be part of. And that future, as Sam was increasingly and urgently aware, was going to be shaped more profoundly than almost anything else by a set of technologies that were, in the early years of his Y Combinator presidency, still developing in university laboratories and small research groups and the quiet back offices of a few extraordinarily far-sighted companies. Technologies that dealt not with location or social networking or commerce or any of the other domains that had defined Silicon Valley's first great era, but with something far more fundamental and far more consequential. Technologies that dealt with the nature of intelligence itself. Sam was paying attention. He had been paying attention for years. And as the conversations around artificial intelligence grew louder and more serious, as the research results began to suggest that things which had seemed decades away were in fact arriving much sooner than anyone had expected, Sam Altman found himself drawn toward the most important question of his generation, the question of what it would mean for humanity when the machines became capable of thinking. The presidency of Y Combinator had been the school. What came next would be the test. Chapter 5. Conceiving OpenAI amid YC leadership, 2014 to 2015. There are conversations that change the direction of history. They do not always announce themselves as such. They happen in ordinary rooms, over ordinary meals, between people who are, in that moment, simply thinking out loud together, following a thread of reasoning wherever it leads, without yet knowing that the place it leads to will matter enormously to the world. The conversations that gave rise to OpenAI were like this. They happened gradually, across many settings and many participants, over the course of months and years, until the accumulated weight of them produced something that could no longer remain merely a conversation. Sam Altman was present for many of these conversations. And as the president of Y Combinator, as someone who spent his days thinking about the future of technology and its implications for human society, he was perhaps better positioned than almost anyone to understand what they meant. The year 2014 was, in the world of artificial intelligence research, a year of quickening. Not yet a year of arrival, the most dramatic demonstrations of what the technology could do were still ahead, but a year when the people paying closest attention began to feel a distinct shift in the atmosphere, a sense that the trajectory of the field had steepened in ways that the conventional forecasts had not anticipated. The research results coming out of the leading academic and industrial AI laboratories were arriving faster, and they were more impressive than the previous year's results. And the year before had been more impressive than the one before that. The technical development driving this acceleration was deep learning, a family of machine learning techniques built around artificial neural networks, inspired loosely by the architecture of the biological brain, capable of learning to perform complex tasks from large quantities of data in ways that previous approaches had not been able to match. Deep learning had been developing quietly for decades, championed by a small group of researchers, Geoffrey Hinton, Yann LeCun, Yoshua Bengio among them, who had continued to believe in the approach through long years when the broader field had been skeptical. And then, around 2012, the results began to arrive in a way that was impossible to ignore. Neural networks trained on large datasets were achieving performance on visual recognition tasks that exceeded not just previous machine learning approaches but, in some cases, human performance. The dam had not broken, but the cracks were clearly visible. Sam had been watching this development with a particular intensity he reserved for things that seemed to him to carry disproportionate future significance. He was not a deep learning researcher himself. His background was in computer science and entrepreneurship, not in the theoretical mathematics of machine learning. But he was an exceptionally good reader of technical fields, with the ability to understand the implications of research results even when the details of the underlying methodology were beyond his immediate expertise. And what the deep learning results were implying, if you followed the logic far enough and honestly enough, was something that most people in 2014 were not yet prepared to say plainly. They were implying that artificial general intelligence, the development of machines capable of performing the full range of cognitive tasks that humans perform, might not be a matter of decades. It might be a matter of years. This was not, in 2014, a mainstream view. The conventional wisdom in the technology industry held that artificial intelligence was a useful tool, increasingly powerful, increasingly applicable to specific domains, genuinely valuable for things like image recognition and language translation and recommendation systems. But the idea that it might produce systems capable of matching or exceeding human intelligence across the board was treated, in most serious technical circles, as either science fiction or as a concern so distant it wasn't worth worrying about today. There were exceptions. Researchers like Nick Bostrom, whose book on superintelligence would be published in 2014, had been thinking seriously about the long-term trajectory of AI for years. But these voices were still largely at the margins of the mainstream conversation. Sam was reading Bostrom. He was reading the technical papers coming out of the leading research groups. He was having conversations with the researchers themselves, the people who were doing the work, who understood from the inside what the results actually meant and what the next set of results was likely to show. And the picture that emerged from all of this reading and all of these conversations was one that he found simultaneously exhilarating and deeply unsettling. Exhilarating because the potential benefits of artificial general intelligence, if it could be developed safely, if it could be directed toward the most pressing problems facing humanity, were almost incomprehensibly large. The ability to accelerate scientific research, to solve problems in medicine and energy and climate that had resisted human effort for generations, to compress centuries of progress into decades. These were possibilities that someone with Sam's fundamental optimism about human potential could not contemplate without excitement. And deeply unsettling because the same technology, developed carelessly or concentrated in the wrong hands, or allowed to pursue objectives that were not properly aligned with human values, carried risks that were equally incomprehensible in scale. The development of systems more capable than humans at cognitive tasks was not simply a technological event. It was a civilizational event. And civilizational events of that magnitude required more than technical ingenuity. They required wisdom, foresight, and above all a set of governance structures and ethical commitments that the technology industry in its current form was entirely unprepared to provide. This was the concern that increasingly occupied Sam's thinking in 2014. Not the question of whether AI would become transformatively powerful. He had concluded, with the calm certainty of someone who has done the intellectual work honestly, that it would. But the question of who would build it, under what constraints, with what values, and in service of what vision of the future. Because the answer to those questions would determine not merely the shape of the technology industry for the next decade, but the shape of human civilization for centuries to come. The conversations were happening in several places simultaneously. Elon Musk, who had been thinking about artificial intelligence and its risks for years, was among those who felt most urgently that something needed to be done. Musk was, by 2014, one of the most prominent and credible voices in the technology world, the founder of Tesla and SpaceX, a person whose willingness to pursue ideas of extraordinary ambition and complexity had earned him a kind of authority that very few people in any field possessed. He shared Sam's concern about the concentration of AI development in the hands of a small number of large technology companies, and he shared the broader worry that the race to build powerful AI systems was proceeding without adequate attention to the question of what happened when those systems became more capable than the people building them. The company that concerned both of them most in this respect was Google, which had in 2014 acquired DeepMind, a London-based AI research laboratory that was producing some of the most impressive results in the field, for a reported $400 million. Google's resources were essentially unlimited. Its access to data was unparalleled. And its competitive incentives were structured in ways that might not, in the long run, align perfectly with the broader interests of humanity. The prospect of a single company, however well-intentioned its leaders, achieving a decisive advantage in the development of artificial general intelligence was one that Sam and Musk and others in their circle found genuinely alarming. The response they began to develop was conceptually audacious. If the concern was that powerful AI would be developed by entities whose interests were not necessarily aligned with humanity as a whole, the answer was to create an entity whose interests were explicitly and structurally so aligned. An organization that would pursue the development of artificial general intelligence not for the benefit of its shareholders or its competitive position, but for the benefit of humanity broadly. An organization that would publish its research openly, so that the broader scientific community could scrutinize it, build on it, and catch errors before they became catastrophic. An organization structured not as a conventional for-profit company but as something more unusual. A non-profit research institution with the resources and the talent to compete at the frontier of the field, while remaining genuinely accountable to a mission that transcended commercial interest. This was the idea that became OpenAI. It did not emerge fully formed from a single conversation. It was assembled gradually, through months of discussion among a group of people who brought different perspectives and different areas of expertise to the question. Sam brought his understanding of institution building, his experience with the startup ecosystem, his ability to attract and evaluate talent. Musk brought his resources and his profile and his particular quality of commitment to large, important, difficult problems. Greg Brockman, a technically brilliant engineer who had been a founding CTO at Stripe, brought deep engineering credibility. Ilya Sutskever, one of the most gifted AI researchers of his generation who had been working at Google, brought the scientific expertise that any serious AI research organization would require at its core. Others joined the conversation: researchers, engineers, investors, advisors, each contributing something to the growing architecture of the idea. The discussions ranged widely, covering the technical roadmap the organization would pursue, the governance structures that would keep it accountable to its mission, the financial model that would give it the resources to compete without compromising its independence, and the cultural values that would shape how it operated day to day. These were not easy questions, and the answers that emerged were, in some cases, genuinely novel. Arrangements and structures that had no clear precedent in either the academic or the commercial world. Sam was managing all of this while continuing to run Y Combinator. This was not a trivial undertaking. Y Combinator in 2014 and 2015 was at the peak of its institutional momentum, processing larger cohorts, attracting more extraordinary founders, occupying a more central position in the Silicon Valley ecosystem than ever before. The demands on Sam's time and attention were already enormous, and adding the intellectual and organizational work of conceptualizing and co-founding a new research institution on top of them required the kind of energy management and prioritization that only someone who had been operating at high intensity for years could sustain. He sustained it because he believed, with a conviction that had only deepened as the conversations progressed, that what was being built in those discussions was more important than anything else he could be doing with his time. The companies in each Y Combinator batch were important. The individual founders he was helping were important. But the question of how humanity navigated the development of artificial general intelligence was important in a different order of magnitude. Important in the way that the decisions made at a small number of critical junctures in the history of civilization are important, carrying consequences that would unfold not over years but over generations. He was also, during this period, doing something that the most effective leaders always do in moments of genuine uncertainty. He was listening to the people who knew things he didn't. He spent time with AI researchers, understanding not just the headline results but the texture of the work, the specific challenges that the field was grappling with, the debates that were live and unresolved among the people who understood these systems from the inside. He spent time with ethicists and policy thinkers and historians of technology, people who brought perspectives that pure technical expertise could not provide. He was building, in other words, the comprehensive understanding that the role he was moving toward would require. By late 2015, the conversations had coalesced into something concrete. The governance structure was in place. The initial funding commitments, totaling $1 billion pledged by Musk, Sam, and a small group of other donors, were secured. The core team was assembled around Ilya Sutskever and Greg Brockman, with a roster of researchers who were among the most talented in the world. And the mission statement had been written, in the spare and unambiguous language that Sam preferred, to ensure that artificial general intelligence benefits all of humanity. On the 11th of December 2015, OpenAI was formally announced to the world. The announcement generated significant attention. The combination of the names involved, the scale of the funding commitment, and the boldness of the stated mission was enough to make it one of the most discussed technology stories of the year. But the attention, while gratifying, was not the point. The point was the work that lay ahead, the difficult, patient, enormously consequential work of actually building the things that the mission required. Sam stood at the threshold of that work in late 2015, 30 years old, simultaneously the president of Y Combinator and a co-founder of what he believed would become one of the most important organizations in human history. He was not naive about the difficulty of what he had helped set in motion. He understood that the gap between a mission statement and its realization was enormous, that the technical challenges were formidable, that the governance questions were unresolved in ways that would create friction and complexity for years to come. But he also understood something else, something that his decade of building companies and leading institutions and thinking carefully about the future had taught him with a clarity that no amount of theoretical reflection could have provided. He understood that the most important things are never easy, and that the difficulty of a problem is not a reason to avoid it but a reason to approach it with more care, more rigor, and more genuine commitment to getting it right. The conversation that had been changing in those quiet rooms and over those ordinary meals had changed direction now. It had become something real. And the world, though it did not yet fully understand what had just been set in motion, would in time come to understand that something significant had begun. Chapter 6. Founding OpenAI in Dual Roles, 2015 to 2019. There is a specific kind of pressure that belongs to the person who has committed, publicly and irrevocably, to doing something that has never been done before. It is not the ordinary pressure of a deadline or a quarterly target or a competitive threat. Pressures that are real and demanding but that exist within a framework of known responses and established playbooks. It is something more fundamental than that. It is the pressure of operating without a map, of making decisions whose consequences will not be fully understood for years, of carrying the weight of a stated mission so large that the distance between where you are and where you need to be is almost too great to contemplate directly. This was the pressure that Sam Altman carried into 2016, as the newly co-founded OpenAI began the work of transforming its founding documents and its funding commitments and its roster of brilliant researchers into an actual functioning research organization. He carried it alongside the continuing demands of the Y Combinator presidency, which had not diminished simply because something more consequential had been added to his responsibilities. He carried it with the outward composure that had become characteristic of him, calm, focused, unhurried in his manner even when the internal reality was anything but unhurried. And he carried it with the deep conviction, never seriously shaken, that the work was worth the wait. The early days of OpenAI were held together by the quality of the people Ilya Sutskever and Greg Brockman had assembled. Research organizations live or die by the caliber of their scientists, and the team that came together in OpenAI's first year was, by any reasonable assessment, extraordinary. These were not simply competent researchers following established methodologies. They were people operating at the genuine frontier of the field. People for whom the questions they were working on were not academic exercises but live and urgent puzzles whose solutions might, in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss, change the nature of human existence. The physical space of the early OpenAI reflected the organization's unusual position between the academic and commercial worlds. The offices in San Francisco had the purposeful informality of a research laboratory, whiteboards covered in equations, clusters of monitors displaying training curves and evaluation metrics, the constant low hum of computational infrastructure working through problems that required more processing power than most universities possessed. It was a place of serious intellectual work and it felt like one. The culture was collaborative and intense, shaped from the beginning by the founding conviction that the problems being worked on were too important and too difficult to be approached with anything less than full commitment. Sam moved through this environment with the particular authority of someone whose role was not to do the research himself but to create the conditions in which the research could flourish. He was the organizational intelligence of OpenAI in those early years, the person responsible for ensuring that the institution had the resources it needed, that its governance remained coherent, that its relationships with the broader world were managed in ways that supported rather than compromised the mission. He was the one who sat across the table from potential funders and explained, with patient clarity, why an organization structured as a non-profit research laboratory could do things that a conventional for-profit company could not. He was the one who navigated the complex and sometimes turbulent relationship with Elon Musk, whose involvement brought enormous resources and visibility but also a particular quality of intensity that required careful management. The relationship with Musk was one of the most significant and most complicated elements of OpenAI's early years. Musk was a co-founder and the organization's largest early donor, and his conviction about the importance of the mission was genuine and deep. But he was also someone with strong views about how the organization should be run, views that did not always align with those of the research leadership or with Sam's own sense of what was strategically correct. The tension was managed for a time, through the shared commitment to the mission and through the mutual respect that the principals had developed over years of interaction. But it was a tension that would ultimately prove irresolvable, and in 2018, Musk departed from OpenAI's board, citing conflicts with his other ventures and differences of opinion about the organization's direction. Sam handled the transition with the steadiness that had become his hallmark in moments of institutional stress. He did not dramatize the departure or allow it to become a distraction from the work. He absorbed the organizational reality of it, adjusted accordingly, and continued. This was, in its own way, a demonstration of the quality that most distinguished his leadership, the ability to remain oriented toward the mission even when the circumstances around it were shifting in ways that were difficult and unpredictable. Meanwhile, at Y Combinator, Sam's presidency was entering its most ambitious phase. The years between 2016 and 2019 saw the organization consolidate its position as the dominant force in startup acceleration while simultaneously expanding its ambitions in directions that had not been part of its original conception. Sam had been pushing, since the earliest days of his presidency, for Y Combinator to engage more seriously with the largest and most difficult problems in science and technology, not just software companies optimizing digital services, but organizations working on the foundational challenges of energy, healthcare, biotechnology, and the built environment. This push found its most direct expression in a series of initiatives that Sam championed during these years. Y Combinator Research, launched in 2015, was an attempt to create a nonprofit research arm that could work on problems too long-term or too fundamental for a traditional startup structure. It was, in its spirit if not its specific form, a forerunner of the kind of institution building that Sam would pursue throughout his career, the attempt to create organizations that could tackle problems at the boundary of what markets could address on their own. Among the projects that Y Combinator Research explored was a study of universal basic income, a concept that Sam had become genuinely interested in as the implications of artificial intelligence for labor markets became more apparent. If AI systems were going to become capable of performing an increasingly large fraction of the cognitive work that humans currently did for pay, then the economic consequences of that transition would be profound and potentially destabilizing. Universal basic income, the idea of providing every citizen with an unconditional regular payment sufficient to cover basic needs, was one proposed response to this challenge, and Sam was interested enough in the empirical question of whether it worked to fund a serious research effort to find out. He was also, during these years, continuing to develop and articulate his views on artificial intelligence through his writing and his public appearances. His essays on AI safety, on the importance of ensuring that powerful AI systems were developed with adequate attention to their potential risks, were circulating widely in the technology community and beginning to reach a broader audience. He was one of a small number of people in positions of genuine influence in the technology industry who were willing to say plainly that the development of artificial general intelligence was not merely a technical project but a civilizational one, that it required not just engineering excellence but wisdom, humility, and a quality of moral seriousness that the industry had not always demonstrated. The dual role that Sam was playing during this period, leading Y Combinator while simultaneously serving as a co-founder and board member of OpenAI, was not without its tensions. The two organizations existed in different worlds, operated under different constraints, and made demands on his attention and judgment that sometimes pointed in different directions. Y Combinator was an institution of enormous breadth, engaged simultaneously with hundreds of companies across dozens of industries, its rhythm set by the semi-annual cadence of application cycles and batch programs and demo days. OpenAI was an institution of extraordinary depth, focused on a single set of problems with an intensity that resisted dilution. Managing this duality required Sam to operate with a clarity of prioritization that most people would find difficult to sustain. He was not someone who allowed the urgent to systematically crowd out the important, who spent so much time responding to the immediate demands of one role that the longer-term, less insistently demanding work of the other was consistently deferred. He moved between the two worlds with the fluency of someone who had internalized the distinction between what needed his attention today and what needed his attention over the span of years, and who had organized himself accordingly. Within OpenAI, the research during these years was producing results that justified the ambition of the founding mission. The organization was making meaningful contributions to the field, publishing work on reinforcement learning, on the challenges of AI safety, on the technical foundations of what would eventually become the large language model architectures that would transform the world's understanding of what AI could do. The work was rigorous and serious and genuinely advancing the state of knowledge, which was exactly what the mission required. But the work was also expensive, in ways that the original nonprofit structure was struggling to accommodate. The compute requirements of frontier AI research were growing exponentially, driven by the empirical observation, first articulated clearly by OpenAI researchers and later known as scaling laws, that larger models trained on more data with more computational power consistently produced better results. The implication of this observation was that the organizations most likely to make progress at the frontier of AI were those with access to the most compute, which meant access to the most capital. And the most capital was not, in the long run, compatible with a nonprofit structure that relied on the charitable impulses of a small group of wealthy donors. This tension led, in 2019, to one of the most consequential structural decisions in OpenAI's history, the creation of a capped profit subsidiary, a novel legal arrangement that allowed OpenAI to accept investment and provide financial returns to investors while placing explicit limits on those returns and maintaining the primacy of the nonprofit mission. It was an imperfect solution to a genuinely difficult problem, and it attracted criticism from various quarters, from those who felt it compromised the purity of the nonprofit mission, and from those who felt the caps were insufficient to prevent the commercial incentives from eventually overwhelming the altruistic ones. Sam was aware of these criticisms. He engaged with them seriously, without defensiveness, and he maintained his conviction that the arrangement, imperfect as it was better than the available alternatives. The year 2019 was also the year in which Sam made a decision that brought his dual identity as Y Combinator president and OpenAI co-founder to a resolution. In March of that year, he stepped down from the presidency of Y Combinator to focus on OpenAI full-time. The departure was handled with the grace and clarity that characterized his significant professional transitions. He left Y Combinator in a position of extraordinary strength, having grown it from a respected accelerator into the central institution of the global startup ecosystem, and he passed the leadership to people who were capable of continuing and building on what he had helped create. He had been at Y Combinator for 8 years. He had arrived as a partner at 26, carrying the lessons of Loopt and the intellectual energy of someone who had found, in the role of mentor and institution builder, a calling that matched his particular combination of talents. He was leaving at 33, having transformed the institution in ways that its founder himself acknowledged were remarkable, having helped hundreds of companies and thousands of founders navigate the most difficult and most critical period of their existence, and having established himself, beyond any reasonable dispute, as one of the most consequential figures in the history of Silicon Valley. He was leaving because something more important required his full attention. He had helped conceive and co-found OpenAI out of the conviction that the development of artificial general intelligence was the most important challenge and the most important opportunity of the era. He had managed his involvement with it alongside his Y Combinator responsibilities for 4 years, contributing what he could from the margins of his attention. Now he was stepping into the center of it, committing himself fully to the work that he believed would define not just his career but, in ways he was only beginning to understand, the future itself. The office at Y Combinator was someone else's now. The twice-yearly rhythms of application review and batch programs and demo days would continue without him, as they should, as the sign of an institution healthy enough to transcend any individual. Sam Altman walked out of that chapter of his life and into the next one carrying everything it had taught him, about building organizations, about identifying and nurturing talent, about the relationship between ambitious vision and practical execution, about the kind of leadership that earns rather than demands the commitment of exceptional people. OpenAI was waiting. The work was waiting. And the future, vast and consequential and utterly unlike anything that had come before, was waiting too. Chapter 7. Full-time CEO, Steering OpenAI Forward, 2019 to 2022. There is a difference between believing in something and betting everything on it. The first is an intellectual position, considered defensible, arrived at through careful reasoning and honest engagement with the evidence. The second is something more total than that. It is the decision to place your full weight on a conviction, to remove the safety nets and the hedges and the comfortable ambiguity of partial commitment, and to say without qualification, "This is where I stand, and this is what I am going to give my life to building." Sam Altman made that bet in 2019. He had believed in the mission of OpenAI since before it had a name, had helped conceive it, helped fund it, helped assemble the people who would carry it forward. But belief, even deep and genuine belief, is different from the total commitment of becoming the full-time chief executive of the organization you believe in. It is different in the way that loving the ocean from the shore is different from swimming in it. The view is similar. The experience is not. He arrived at OpenAI's offices in San Francisco in the spring of 2019 with the unhurried purposefulness of someone who has been preparing for a moment without knowing precisely when it would arrive. The organization he was now leading full-time was considerably more developed than the one that had been announced to the world 4 years earlier. It had grown, in headcount, in computational resources, in the breadth and depth of its research program, in its relationships with the broader scientific community and with the policy world and with the technology industry that was watching its progress with a mixture of admiration and competitive anxiety. But it was also, in important ways, still finding itself, still working out the relationship between its nonprofit mission and its new capped profit structure, still navigating the question of how an organization committed to openness and safety could operate effectively in a world where the competitive pressure to move fast was intensifying with each passing month. Sam's first priority as full-time CEO was to establish the kind of organizational clarity that allows a research institution to operate at its best. This meant articulating, with precision and consistency, what OpenAI was actually trying to do and why, not in the abstract language of mission statements, but in the concrete, operational terms that guide daily decisions. It meant building the management infrastructure that the organization's growing size required, without allowing that infrastructure to calcify into the kind of bureaucratic rigidity that kills the intellectual vitality of research institutions. And it meant establishing a culture, a set of shared values and shared practices, that would remain coherent as the organization continued to grow and as the pressures on it continued to intensify. He was, in this sense, doing for OpenAI what he had done for Y Combinator, taking an institution that had been built on the inspiration and vision of its founding generation and giving it the organizational depth and structural resilience it needed to become something larger and more durable than any single founding generation could sustain. It was work he understood intimately, and he brought to it the full repertoire of capabilities he had been developing since his first days as a founder. The research, meanwhile, was moving in directions that were beginning to make even the most cautious observers pay very close attention. The development of the generative pre-trained transformer, GPT, architecture represented a significant shift in how OpenAI was approaching the problem of building capable AI systems. Where earlier approaches had focused on training specialized systems to perform specific tasks, the GPT approach was different in kind. It involved training a single large model on an enormous quantity of text, essentially a substantial fraction of the written output of human civilization, and observing that the resulting system demonstrated surprising and sometimes startling capabilities across a wide range of tasks, without having been specifically trained to perform any of them. GPT-1, released in 2018, had been a proof of concept, impressive to the researchers who understood what it represented, but not yet capable enough to capture broad attention. GPT-2, released in 2019, was different. It was significantly more capable, able to generate coherent and sometimes remarkably convincing text on virtually any topic, to continue a story or an argument or a piece of code in ways that demonstrated something that looked, from the outside, startlingly like understanding. OpenAI made the unusual decision to release GPT-2 in stages rather than all at once, citing concerns about the potential for the technology to be misused for generating disinformation and propaganda. This decision was itself revealing. It demonstrated that the organization was taking seriously the question of how its research would interact with the world, not merely the question of how to advance the research. Sam was deeply involved in these decisions. He was not the technical architect of the GPT systems. That work belonged to Ilya Sutskever and the research team he had assembled. But Sam was the person who had to translate the technical results into organizational decisions, into communications with the outside world, into the governance frameworks that determined how the technology would be released and under what conditions. He was the interface between the research and everything else, between the laboratory and the boardroom, between the scientific community and the policy world, between OpenAI's internal culture of ambitious inquiry and the external world's growing awareness that something significant was happening in those San Francisco offices. The release of GPT-3 in 2020 marked an inflection point, not just for OpenAI but for the broader public conversation about artificial intelligence. GPT-3 was, by the standards of what had come before, a system of almost incomprehensible scale, trained on hundreds of billions of words, containing 175 billion parameters, capable of performing tasks ranging from writing essays and poetry to answering factual questions to generating functional computer code, all from a simple text prompt. The responses it produced were not always correct. The system hallucinated facts with the same fluency with which it produced accurate ones, and its reasoning on complex logical problems was unreliable in ways that revealed the fundamental differences between its mode of processing and genuine human understanding. But the quality and versatility of what it could do was sufficient to generate a wave of genuine astonishment among the researchers, technologists, journalists, and curious members of the public who encountered it. Sam managed the aftermath of GPT-3's release with the careful attention of someone who understood that the narrative forming around the technology was as important as the technology itself. He was present in the public conversation, writing, speaking, giving interviews, with a consistency and a clarity that was itself a form of leadership. He was not trying to hype the technology beyond its actual capabilities, nor was he attempting to minimize those capabilities in the service of managing public anxiety. He was trying, with genuine seriousness, to give people an accurate picture of what had been built, what it could and could not do, and what it meant for the future. This was harder than it sounds because the accurate picture was itself remarkable, and the distance between accurate description and hype is narrow when the subject matter is genuinely extraordinary. The world that GPT-3 arrived into in 2020 was one already under profound stress. The COVID-19 pandemic had disrupted virtually every aspect of ordinary life across the globe, shutting down economies, isolating individuals and families, straining healthcare systems, and accelerating the adoption of digital technologies in ways that compressed years of change into months. The technology industry, which had been growing rapidly before the pandemic, found itself, paradoxically, one of the few sectors in which the disruption created opportunity as well as difficulty. Remote work, digital communication, online commerce. All of these expanded dramatically as the pandemic made physical interaction dangerous, and the companies and technologies that enabled them found themselves at the center of a world that was reorganizing itself around them. For OpenAI, the pandemic created both challenges and opportunities. The challenges were organizational, managing a research organization through the disruption of remote work, maintaining the collaborative culture that serious research requires when the researchers could not be in the same room. The opportunities were subtler but real. The pandemic was accelerating the digitization of the economy in ways that made the capabilities of advanced AI systems more relevant and more commercially valuable than they had been a year earlier. The API that OpenAI had released to give developers access to GPT-3 was generating genuine excitement, as builders discovered that the model could be integrated into applications in ways that produced results that seemed, to end users, almost magical. Sam was thinking during this period about the relationship between OpenAI's research mission and its commercial viability in terms that were becoming increasingly sophisticated. The capped profit structure that had been created in 2019 was designed to allow OpenAI to attract investment while preserving the primacy of the mission. But the practical reality of operating a frontier AI research organization was that the resource requirements were growing faster than the philanthropic model could sustainably support. The compute required to train systems at the scale of GPT-3 was measured in tens of millions of dollars. The systems that would follow GPT-3 would require more. And the systems after those would require more still. This reality was pushing Sam toward a partnership that would prove enormously consequential. Microsoft, under the leadership of Satya Nadella, had been watching OpenAI's progress with the kind of focused attention that precedes a major strategic commitment. Microsoft was a company in the midst of its own transformation, having reinvented itself under Nadella from a legacy software company defined by its past into a cloud computing and enterprise software powerhouse oriented toward the future. Nadella had the vision to see that artificial intelligence was not merely a feature to be added to existing products but a fundamental shift in the nature of computing itself, and he had the strategic clarity to understand that the organization best positioned to lead that shift was OpenAI. The partnership that resulted was announced in 2019 and deepened significantly in the years that followed. Microsoft invested $1 billion in OpenAI, and the relationship that developed between the two organizations was more than merely financial. It involved deep technical collaboration, Microsoft providing the computational infrastructure that OpenAI's research required, in exchange for preferred access to OpenAI's technology for integration into Microsoft's products and services. It was a partnership that required careful management, because the interests of the two organizations were aligned in important ways but not in all ways, and maintaining the integrity of OpenAI's mission while building a productive commercial relationship with one of the world's largest technology companies required the kind of nuanced judgment that Sam had been developing for his entire career. He managed it with the steady hand of someone who had learned, through years of navigating complex institutional relationships, that the key to maintaining integrity in a partnership is clarity about what each party is and what it is not, about what can be shared and what must remain separate, about the boundaries that, if respected, allow genuine collaboration to flourish. The Microsoft partnership gave OpenAI the resources to continue its research at the frontier. The research at the frontier gave Microsoft the technology to reimagine its products. The mission that animated both the research and the partnership gave Sam the North Star he needed to navigate the tensions that inevitably arose between them. Through 2021 and into 2022, the momentum inside OpenAI was building toward something that Sam could feel more clearly than he could yet articulate publicly. The research team, led by Ilya Sutskever and populated by some of the most talented AI scientists in the world, was working on systems that were significantly more capable than anything that had been publicly released. The scaling laws that had been articulated in 2020, the empirical observation that larger models trained on more data consistently produced better results, were continuing to hold, which meant that each new generation of systems was delivering improvements that surprised even the researchers building them. The internal evaluations were producing results that made even the most experienced people in the organization pause and reconsider their assumptions about the timeline of what was coming. Sam was processing these results with the particular intensity of someone who has committed his professional life to a mission and is beginning to see the evidence that the mission was correctly conceived and that the timeline is shorter than most people outside the laboratory walls understand. He was also processing them with the sobriety of someone who takes seriously the weight of what it means to be among the first people in history to encounter systems of this capability, to be responsible for decisions about how they are developed and released and governed that will have consequences far beyond anything that can be fully foreseen. He was not alone in carrying this weight. He carried it alongside Ilya Sutskever, whose technical brilliance was matched by a genuine and deeply felt commitment to the question of AI safety. He carried it alongside Greg Brockman, whose engineering rigor and organizational loyalty were foundational to everything OpenAI had built. He carried it alongside the researchers and engineers and policy professionals who had chosen to work at OpenAI precisely because they believed that the mission, ensuring that artificial general intelligence benefits all of humanity, was the right mission pursued in the right way by the right people. But he carried more of it than anyone. That is the nature of the chief executive's role, not merely to share the burden of difficult decisions but to be, ultimately, the person in whom the organization's identity and direction are most fully concentrated. The joys of that role are real. So are its demands. By the end of 2022, those demands were about to become more public, more intense, and more consequential than anything Sam Altman had yet experienced. The work that had been proceeding quietly in those San Francisco offices, the research, the training runs, the evaluations, the careful deliberations about readiness and responsibility, was approaching a moment of contact with the world. A moment that would change, in ways both anticipated and entirely unforeseen, everything. The world did not yet know what was coming. But Sam Altman did. And he was ready. Chapter 8. The ChatGPT Explosion and Boardroom Turmoil, 2022 to 2023. There are moments in the history of technology when something crosses a threshold, when a capability that has been developing quietly, in laboratories and research papers and internal demonstrations visible only to specialists, suddenly becomes available to ordinary people in a form they can immediately understand and use. These moments are rare, and they are recognizable only in retrospect by most of the world, but the people closest to the work feel them coming with a certainty that is difficult to articulate and impossible to dismiss. Sam Altman felt this one coming. And on the 30th of November 2022, it arrived. ChatGPT launched on that Wednesday with the quiet confidence of a product whose creators believed in it but could not have fully anticipated what was about to happen. It was not released with the fanfare of a major product launch. No stage presentation, no carefully orchestrated press campaign, no countdown timer on a web page building anticipation over weeks. It was released simply, directly, as a research preview. An invitation to the public to interact with a conversational AI system built on the foundation of the GPT architecture that OpenAI had been developing and refining for years. Anyone with an internet connection could create an account. Anyone who created an account could begin a conversation. The barrier to entry was essentially zero. The response was unlike anything the technology industry had seen before. Within 5 days of its launch, ChatGPT had accumulated 1 million users. Within 2 months, it had reached 100 million, a rate of adoption that no consumer application in history had achieved as quickly, surpassing the trajectories of Instagram and TikTok and every other platform that had previously held the record for fastest growth. The servers strained under the load. The waitlist grew. The conversations multiplied across every platform and every medium. In newspaper columns and academic journals and office break rooms and family dinner tables and late-night television monologues, as the world collectively tried to process what it had just encountered. What people encountered when they opened ChatGPT for the first time was something that was simultaneously familiar and utterly new. The interface was simple: a text box, a send button, a conversation that accumulated on the screen in the back-and-forth format of a messaging application. But the entity on the other side of that interface was unlike anything that had previously been available to the public. It could discuss philosophy and write poetry and explain quantum mechanics and generate code and offer medical information and debate ethics and tell jokes and summarize documents and translate languages and tutor children and draft emails, all in response to plain English prompts, all with a fluency and apparent comprehension that made even the most technically sophisticated users stop and reconsider their assumptions about what machines were capable of. Sam watched the launch and its aftermath with a quality of attention that combined genuine satisfaction with something more complex. The particular alertness of someone who understands that a new chapter has begun and that the rules of the new chapter are not yet fully written. He had been working toward this moment for years, had understood with increasing clarity that the systems his organization was building would eventually produce exactly this kind of public awakening. But understanding that something will happen and experiencing it happening are different things, and the scale and speed of ChatGPT's adoption exceeded even the most optimistic internal projections. He was present everywhere in the weeks following the launch, in media interviews, in conversations with policymakers, in public appearances at conferences and summits where the questions coming from every direction were the same questions, asked with varying degrees of excitement and anxiety. What does this mean? How capable will these systems become? What are the risks? Who is responsible for managing them? Sam answered these questions with the measured clarity that had become his public signature, acknowledging the genuine capability of what had been built, being honest about its limitations and its risks, and maintaining throughout the conviction that the right response to powerful technology was not fear or prohibition but serious, sustained engagement with the challenge of developing it responsibly. The commercial implications of ChatGPT's success were immediate and profound. Microsoft, which had deepened its investment in OpenAI and integrated GPT technology into its Azure cloud platform, moved quickly to announce plans to incorporate the underlying technology into its core products. Most dramatically into Bing, its search engine, which had for years languished in the enormous shadow of Google's dominance. The announcement that Bing would be powered by ChatGPT-style AI sent a jolt through the technology industry, triggering what commentators quickly described as an AI arms race, a period of intense competitive activity in which every major technology company felt compelled to demonstrate its own AI capabilities before the market concluded that it had been left behind. Google, which had been conducting its own large language model research for years and whose researchers had in fact made some of the foundational contributions to the transformer architecture that underlay GPT, found itself in the uncomfortable position of appearing to lag behind a younger and smaller competitor in the category that everyone had suddenly decided was the most important in technology. Amazon, Meta, and a constellation of well-funded startups, Anthropic, Cohere, Mistral, among others, all accelerated their own AI development programs in response to the pressure that ChatGPT's success had created. The field that had been developing at a rapid but manageable pace was suddenly operating at a velocity that felt, to many observers, dangerously close to uncontrolled. Sam moved through this transformed landscape with the authority of someone who had been thinking about these dynamics longer and more carefully than almost anyone else involved. He was not triumphalist about what ChatGPT had achieved. He was too aware of the limitations of the current systems and too conscious of the risks ahead to allow himself the luxury of uncomplicated satisfaction. But he was also not apologetic. He had built OpenAI on the conviction that the development of powerful AI was inevitable, and that the question was not whether it would happen but who would build it and under what values and with what degree of attention to the consequences. ChatGPT's success was, in an important sense, a validation of that conviction. Evidence that the work his organization had been doing was both technically excellent and genuinely aligned with what people, given the opportunity, actually wanted from AI. The months that followed were months of extraordinary intensity on every dimension simultaneously. The research team was working on the next generation of systems, GPT-4, which would be released in March of 2023 and which would demonstrate capabilities significantly beyond those of the system that had already astonished the world. The commercial team was working to build the business infrastructure that would allow OpenAI to generate the revenue its research ambitions required. The policy team was engaging with governments and regulatory bodies around the world as legislators and officials, alerted by ChatGPT's impact to the urgency of the questions it raised, began the process of trying to understand what they were dealing with and how to respond to it. Sam himself was operating at a level of public engagement that was new in its scope and its demands. He was testifying before the United States Senate, sitting across from senators who ranged in their understanding of AI from genuinely sophisticated to entirely uninformed, and making the case, with patient precision, for the importance of thoughtful regulation, not the reflexive prohibition that fear might counsel, but the serious, technically informed governance frameworks that the moment required. He was meeting with heads of state and prime ministers and presidents, carrying the message that what was happening in AI was not a niche technology story but a civilizational development that deserved the attention of the people responsible for governing civilizations. He was making a world tour of sorts, visiting governments across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, that was less a diplomatic exercise than an educational one, an attempt to ensure that the people with the power to shape the regulatory environment understood what they were regulating. And then, in November of 2023, exactly 1 year after ChatGPT's launch had changed the world, something happened that threatened to change everything Sam Altman had spent his career building. On the 17th of November, 2023, the board of OpenAI fired Sam Altman as chief executive officer. The announcement came on a Friday afternoon, delivered with a bluntness that shocked the technology industry and left the organization's employees, investors, and partners scrambling to understand what had happened. The stated reason, in the board's terse public communication, was that Sam had not been consistently candid with the board, a characterization that Sam disputed immediately and that the available evidence would struggle to substantiate in the days that followed. The board that fired him was a small and unusual body. The governance structure of OpenAI's nonprofit parent gave it authority that was largely independent of the commercial interests of the organization's investors, which was by design, the structural expression of the founding conviction that OpenAI's mission could not be subordinated to the profit motive. But the exercise of that authority in this moment was, by almost any assessment, catastrophic in its execution. The board had acted without adequate preparation, without a coherent succession plan, without having secured the support of the organization's key personnel, and without having conducted the kind of process that decisions of this magnitude required. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Virtually the entire senior leadership of OpenAI, Greg Brockman, who had been chair of the board and who resigned in solidarity with Sam, along with a cascade of other senior researchers and engineers, made clear within hours that they would follow Sam out of the organization if he did not return. Microsoft, which had invested $13 billion in OpenAI by this point and whose products and commercial strategy were deeply entangled with OpenAI's technology, expressed its displeasure with unusual directness. Satya Nadella announced that Sam and Greg would be joining Microsoft to lead a new AI research team, a move that was simultaneously a demonstration of Microsoft's faith in Sam personally and a dramatic illustration of what OpenAI stood to lose if the situation was not resolved. The 5 days that followed were among the most dramatic in the history of the technology industry. Negotiations proceeded continuously, involving lawyers and board members and investors and advisors, as the various parties tried to find a resolution that could preserve OpenAI as a functioning organization. The employees of OpenAI, more than 700 of them, signed a letter stating that they would resign and follow Sam to Microsoft unless the board reversed its decision and resigned. The letter was not a bluff. The people who signed it meant it. And the board, confronted with the reality that firing Sam Altman had not weakened OpenAI but had instead placed the organization on the edge of a dissolution that would have destroyed years of work and billions of dollars of value, reversed course. On the 22nd of November, 5 days after his firing, Sam Altman returned to OpenAI as chief executive officer. He walked back into the office he had been removed from with the composure of someone who had just lived through one of the most disorienting experiences of his professional life and had emerged from it with his purpose intact and his commitment undiminished. The board that had fired him was reconstituted, new members brought in, new governance arrangements established, a recognition built into the new structures that the events of the previous 5 days had revealed serious deficiencies in how the organization was governed. He did not dramatize his return. He did not use the occasion for recrimination or for the public settling of scores that the circumstances might have seemed to invite. He gave a brief statement, thanked the employees whose support had been the decisive factor in the resolution of the crisis, and returned to work. This was itself a form of leadership, the demonstration through action rather than words, that the mission was larger than the drama, that the work mattered more than the narrative, and that the right response to having survived a serious institutional crisis was to get back to building the thing you had always been building. The episode revealed something important about Sam Altman that might not have been as visible in calmer times. It revealed the depth of the trust he had built with the people who worked for him, trust not purchased by generous compensation or accumulated through the ordinary transactions of organizational life, but earned through years of genuine engagement, of treating people as intelligent adults, of sharing his thinking honestly and inviting honest thinking in return. More than 700 people had been willing to walk away from their careers, their stock options, their professional futures, rather than work for an OpenAI without Sam Altman. That is not a response you can manufacture. It is a response you earn slowly and genuinely, over years of being the kind of leader people want to follow. It also revealed the fragility of the governance structures that the founding generation of OpenAI had put in place, and the importance of getting those structures right going forward. The events of November 2023 were not merely a personal drama. They were an institutional stress test, and the institution had come uncomfortably close to failing it. Sam understood this with the sober clarity of someone who has just been reminded, in the most direct possible way, that the organizations we build reflect and amplify the quality of the thinking we put into their governance, and that insufficient thinking about governance does not remain merely a structural problem. It becomes a human one with human consequences, measured in disruption and uncertainty and the near loss of something genuinely important. He returned to his desk in late November 2023 carrying all of this. The world's most advanced AI laboratory was intact. The team that had built it was still there. The mission that had animated it from the beginning was still the mission. And Sam Altman, 38 years old, tested in a way that very few leaders are tested and found to be, in the most meaningful sense of the word, irreplaceable, was back at the center of the most consequential technological project in human history. The year that had begun with a product launch that changed the world had ended with a governance crisis that, in its near-catastrophic failure and its ultimately successful resolution, had clarified something essential. The work was too important to be derailed by anything. Not by competition, not by regulatory pressure, not by the internal fractures that institutions under stress inevitably develop, and not, as it had now been demonstrated, by a board's decision to remove the person most responsible for the organization's direction and success. The work continued. It always had. And it always would. Chapter 9. Reinstatement and Resilience, 2023 to 2024. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives only after a crisis. Not the false clarity of relief, the temporary lifting of anxiety that comes when an immediate danger has passed, but something deeper and more durable than that. It is the clarity that comes from having been tested at the level of your foundations, from having discovered, under conditions that did not permit performance or pretense, what you are actually made of and what you actually believe. It is the clarity of a person who has looked directly at the possibility of losing everything they have built and has found, in that looking, that their commitment to the work was not contingent on keeping the title or the office or the institutional authority. That it was simply, irreducibly, theirs. Sam Altman possessed this clarity as he returned to OpenAI in the final days of November 2023. He carried it quietly, without display, in the manner of someone who has learned that the most important things do not require announcement. The 5 days of his removal had been, by any external measure, a period of extraordinary disruption, a careening sequence of announcements and counter-announcements, resignations and negotiations, public statements and private communications, that had held the entire technology industry in a state of suspended disbelief. But for Sam, whatever turbulence those days contained internally, they had produced something valuable. They had produced certainty. Certainty about what mattered, certainty about who the people were that he was building with, and certainty about the path forward. The immediate work of his return was organizational. OpenAI needed stabilization, not in the sense of damage control, the management of a reputation or a narrative, but in the deeper operational sense of an institution that had been subjected to a severe shock and needed to re-establish its equilibrium. The board had been reconstituted, bringing in new members whose experience and judgment were better suited to the governance demands of an organization at OpenAI's stage of development. Brett Taylor, a highly respected technologist and former co-CEO of Salesforce, was brought in as chair. Larry Summers, the economist and former Treasury Secretary, joined as a board member. The reconstituted board represented a significant upgrade in the quality of institutional oversight. People who understood both the commercial realities of a large technology organization and the governance responsibilities that the nonprofit mission imposed. Sam worked with the new board to establish the kind of relationship between the CEO and the governing body that the previous arrangement had so clearly lacked. One built on genuine communication, on shared understanding of strategic priorities, on the mutual trust that allows an organization to move quickly and confidently because its leadership and its governance are genuinely aligned rather than operating in a state of latent tension. He was deliberate about this, spending significant time in the months following his return building the relationships and the communication structures that would prevent a recurrence of what had happened. He had no interest in relitigating the past. He had every interest in ensuring that the future was structured differently. The employees, whose solidarity had been the decisive factor in his reinstatement, returned to their work with a quality of commitment that had, if anything, been intensified by what they had been through together. There is a particular bond that forms among people who have faced a genuine test as a group, who have been asked in real time and under real pressure, whether they believed in what they were building enough to risk something significant for it, and who have answered yes. The OpenAI that emerged from November 2023 was, in this sense, a more cohesive organization than the one that had entered it. The crisis had done the work that years of ordinary institutional life could not have done. It had revealed to everyone involved the depth of their collective commitment. Sam channeled this renewed energy into a period of extraordinary productivity. The months following his reinstatement saw OpenAI operating with a focus and an ambition that reflected both the momentum of the previous year and the clarity that the crisis had produced. The research pipeline was full. The commercial business was growing at a rate that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. And the public conversation about AI, which ChatGPT's launch had ignited and which had been burning at an unprecedented intensity ever since, was creating both opportunities and responsibilities that required his continuous engagement. GPT-4, which had been released in March of 2023, had demonstrated capabilities that extended significantly beyond those of its predecessor. More sophisticated reasoning, better performance on professional examinations, a multimodal capacity that allowed it to process and respond to images as well as text. The evaluations that researchers had conducted on GPT-4 before its release had produced results that were, in some cases, genuinely startling: performance on the bar exam, on medical licensing tests, on standardized assessments across a range of professional domains that placed the system in the upper percentiles of human performance. These were not party tricks. They were indicators of something real and significant about the direction in which the technology was developing. But the system that was generating the most excitement inside OpenAI in the months following Sam's return was not GPT-4. It was the work that had been quietly proceeding on its successor, work that was oriented not merely toward incremental improvements in the capabilities that GPT-4 had demonstrated, but toward a more fundamental reimagining of what an AI system could do. The concept of an AI that could not only respond to prompts but could reason through problems step by step, that could approach complex challenges with something resembling the deliberate, structured thinking of a human expert working through a difficult question, was one that Sam found deeply compelling, both for what it would mean technically and for what it would mean for the mission. He was also, during this period, continuing to navigate the complex landscape of partnerships, investments, and relationships that OpenAI's commercial success had created. The relationship with Microsoft remained the central pillar of OpenAI's commercial strategy, and Sam worked continuously to ensure that it remained productive, that the integration of OpenAI's technology into Microsoft's products was generating real value for users, that the financial relationship was sustainable and equitable, and that the commercial imperatives of the partnership were not, at any point, distorting the research priorities that the mission required. But Sam was also thinking about OpenAI's broader position in the world with an ambition that went considerably beyond the Microsoft relationship. The organization had become, in the course of 2023, something that it had not been at the beginning of the year: a company whose products were used by hundreds of millions of people, whose technology was integrated into thousands of applications built by third-party developers, and whose decisions about what to build and how to release it had genuine and immediate consequences for people far beyond the technology industry. This was a different kind of responsibility than the one OpenAI had carried in its earlier, more purely research-oriented phase, and Sam was thinking carefully about what it meant. The question of safety, of how to ensure that AI systems developed by OpenAI behaved in ways that were beneficial and not harmful, had always been central to the organization's mission. But the question had taken on new dimensions as the systems had become more capable and more widely deployed. The risks that a more powerful and more widely used system posed were different in kind from the risks posed by a research prototype, and the governance structures and technical approaches required to manage them were correspondingly more demanding. Sam had established a dedicated safety team within OpenAI, and he was engaged in ongoing conversations with the broader AI safety research community, at Anthropic, at DeepMind, at academic institutions around the world, about the shared challenge of ensuring that the development of increasingly capable AI systems did not outpace humanity's ability to understand and govern them. He was also engaging, with increasing directness, with the policy dimension of this challenge. The conversations he had begun with governments during the AI arms race of early 2023 had deepened and multiplied, and Sam was becoming one of the most recognizable and most credible voices in the global conversation about AI governance. He was not advocating for any particular regulatory framework with the simplistic certainty of a lobbyist. He was engaging seriously with the genuine complexity of the problem, with the tension between the need for governance and the risk that poorly designed governance would slow beneficial development, with the challenge of creating international coordination mechanisms in a world where competitive pressures between nations were pushing in the opposite direction, with the fundamental difficulty of writing rules for a technology whose capabilities were evolving faster than any regulatory process could track. His approach to these conversations reflected the intellectual style that had characterized his engagement with hard problems throughout his career, a combination of genuine humility about uncertainty and genuine confidence about the things that could be said with reasonable certainty. He was willing to say plainly and publicly that he did not know exactly how powerful AI systems would become or exactly when they would reach various capability thresholds. But he was equally willing to say with equal plainness that the responsible course of action was to treat the most concerning scenarios as live possibilities and to build the governance frameworks that would be required if they materialized, rather than waiting until they had materialized to begin building them. This quality of taking risks seriously without being paralyzed by it, of acting with urgency and care simultaneously, was the signature of Sam's public posture on AI in this period. It was a difficult posture to maintain, because the pressures pushing toward both extremes were intense. On one side, the excitement generated by ChatGPT's success and by the genuine capabilities of the systems being developed was creating a cultural pressure toward enthusiasm that was not always tempered by adequate attention to risk. On the other side, a growing community of critics was arguing that the development of powerful AI should be paused or severely restricted, that the risks of proceeding outweighed the benefits, that the organizations building these systems could not be trusted to self-regulate. Sam pushed back against both of these extremes with the patient persistence of someone who believes that the truth, in genuinely complex situations, is almost always more nuanced than the loudest voices on either side. The year 2024 brought new capabilities, new challenges, and new evidence that the pace of development was, if anything, continuing to accelerate. The release of new model generations, each one more capable than the last, each one extending the range of tasks that AI systems could perform with a quality that approached or matched human performance, was producing a compound effect in the public consciousness. The wonder of the initial ChatGPT moment had not dissipated. If anything, it had deepened as people who had initially encountered the technology with curiosity began to integrate it into their daily lives and to develop an intuitive sense of what it could and couldn't do, what it was good for and where it fell short. Sam was watching this integration with the attentiveness of someone who understood that the way people actually used AI systems, as opposed to the way researchers imagined they would use them, was one of the most important sources of information about what the technology was and what it was becoming. He was listening to the feedback from users, from developers building on OpenAI's API, from the enterprise customers who were integrating AI into their business processes, and from the researchers studying the social and economic implications of widespread AI adoption. He was building, from all of this, a picture of a world in transition, a world in which the relationship between human capability and machine capability was being renegotiated in real time, with consequences that were unfolding faster than anyone's ability to fully map them. He was also, more quietly but no less importantly, thinking about the longer arc. The immediate commercial success of OpenAI's products was gratifying and strategically important. But the mission, ensuring that artificial general intelligence benefits all of humanity, was not a mission that would be fulfilled by building successful products. It would be fulfilled, or not, by the choices made at the moments when the technology reached capability thresholds that genuinely changed the calculus of what was at stake. Sam believed, with a conviction that had only grown stronger as the evidence accumulated, that those moments were closer than most people understood. And he believed, with equal conviction, that the choices made now, in the governance structures being built, in the safety research being conducted, in the cultural norms being established within the AI research community, would shape the outcomes at those moments in ways that were not yet inevitable but that were becoming progressively harder to change. This was the weight he carried through 2024, and he carried it without allowing it to become debilitating. He maintained the quality of engagement, with the work, with the people, with the public conversation, that had characterized his leadership at its best. He remained accessible, remained honest, remained willing to engage with hard questions without retreating into comfortable abstractions. He continued to build, continued to think, continued to push the organization he led toward the capabilities and the governance structures and the cultural commitments that the mission required. The crisis of November 2023 had been, in retrospect, not a detour from the story of Sam Altman's life but one of its most clarifying chapters. It had revealed, under conditions that could not be manufactured or simulated, the depth of his commitment to the work and the quality of the relationships he had built with the people doing it. It had produced a stronger organization and a more thoughtful governance structure. And it had given Sam Altman something that very few leaders at his level of success ever receive, an unambiguous answer to the question of whether, when it truly mattered, the people he had given his professional life to building with believed in him as fully as he believed in them. The answer had been yes. Loudly, unmistakably, and at real personal cost to the people who gave it. He had not forgotten this. He would not forget it. And in the years ahead, as the work entered its most consequential phase, the memory of that answer would be among the most important things he carried. Chapter 10. Shaping Tomorrow: AI Investments and Beyond 2024 Present. There is a particular vantage point that belongs only to the person who has spent long enough inside a profound transformation to see both where it began and where it is going. It is not the vantage point of the observer, the analyst, the commentator who watches from a careful distance and offers considered assessments of what others are building. It is the vantage point of the builder, the person who has been present at the creation, who has made the decisions and absorbed the consequences and continued anyway, who carries in their body and their memory the full texture of the journey from the first uncertain steps to the extraordinary present moment. Sam Altman occupies this vantage point in 2024, and what he sees from it is something that very few people in the history of technology have ever been positioned to see. He sees a world that is, in the most literal sense, being remade. The systems that OpenAI released into the world in the years following ChatGPT's launch were not merely products in the conventional sense. Tools that made certain tasks more efficient or certain experiences more convenient. They were something more fundamental than that. They were the first widely accessible demonstrations of a new kind of intelligence. Not human intelligence, but something related to it, something that had learned from the accumulated written output of human civilization and could engage with the full range of human intellectual inquiry in ways that felt, to the people engaging with them, genuinely responsive and genuinely capable. The implications of this were unfolding across every domain of human activity simultaneously, and the speed of the unfolding was not slowing. In the scientific research community, AI systems were beginning to accelerate the pace of discovery in ways that had been predicted theoretically but were now becoming empirically visible. In medicine, AI-assisted analysis was demonstrating capabilities in diagnostics and drug discovery that were compressing research timelines that had previously been measured in decades. In software engineering, the integration of AI coding assistants into the development workflow was changing the nature of programming itself, expanding what individual developers could build, lowering the barriers to software creation, and beginning to raise questions about the long-term structure of the software industry that had not previously seemed urgent. In education, in law, in finance, in every profession that involved the processing and generation of language and reasoning, the presence of AI systems was creating new possibilities and new pressures simultaneously. Sam was watching all of this with the synthesizing attention of someone whose job required him to hold the full picture. Not just the technical progress, not just the commercial metrics, not just the policy developments, but all of it together, in a single coherent understanding of where the world was and where it was going. He had always been a systems thinker, someone whose instinct was to find the structure that connected disparate things rather than to analyze them in isolation. This instinct was serving him well in a moment when the connections between AI's technical development and its social, economic, and political consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. The commercial trajectory of OpenAI in 2024 reflected the technology's broader impact. The organization had grown from a research laboratory of a few hundred people into a company of thousands, generating revenue that was measured in billions of dollars annually and supporting a product ecosystem that extended from the consumer ChatGPT application to enterprise software integrations to the API platform that hundreds of thousands of developers were using to build their own AI-powered applications. The Microsoft partnership continued to be a central pillar of this commercial success, with OpenAI's technology integrated into Copilot and a growing range of Microsoft's enterprise products, reaching hundreds of millions of users who were encountering AI assistants as a feature of the tools they already used for work. Sam was managing this commercial growth while simultaneously maintaining his focus on the research frontier, on the development of the next generation of systems that would be significantly more capable than anything that had been publicly released. The work on reasoning, on building AI systems that could approach complex problems not merely by pattern matching against their training data but through something more resembling genuine deliberate thought, was advancing with the kind of momentum that made even the researchers most deeply familiar with the technical details pause periodically to recalibrate their sense of what was coming and how soon. The release of the O1 model in September 2024 represented a significant step in this direction. Where previous GPT models had been remarkable for the breadth and fluency of their responses, O1 was designed to think before it answered, to work through problems step by step, to consider multiple approaches, to catch and correct errors in its own reasoning in ways that earlier systems had not been capable of. The improvement in performance on tasks requiring complex reasoning was substantial, and it provided a preview of a capability trajectory that Sam believed would continue to steepen. He spoke about this trajectory with a frankness that was, in the context of the technology industry's habitual optimism about its own products, notable for its sobriety. He was not predicting specific capability milestones on specific timelines. He was too intellectually honest about the fundamental uncertainty of predicting the pace of technological development to offer the kind of confident forecast that audiences often wanted to hear. But he was saying, consistently and plainly, that the systems of 2025 and 2026 would be significantly more capable than those of 2024, and that the systems of the late 2020s would represent a qualitative change in what AI could do that would make the current moment look, in retrospect, like the early days of something whose full significance had not yet been grasped. He was also saying something else, something more challenging and more important. He was saying that the development of artificial general intelligence, the creation of systems capable of performing intellectual work across the full range of domains at a level that matched or exceeded the best human experts, was no longer a theoretical future possibility. It was an engineering project that was underway with a timeline that was measured in years rather than decades, and that the decisions being made now, about safety, about governance, about the distribution of the benefits and the management of the risks, would shape the outcomes of that project in ways that humanity would live with for a very long time. This message was not universally welcome. There were audiences who found it alarmist, who felt that the emphasis on risk and governance was a distraction from the genuine benefits that AI was already delivering. There were other audiences who felt it was insufficiently alarming, who believed that the development of AI should be slowed or stopped entirely, that the risks of proceeding outweighed any possible benefit. Sam engaged with both of these positions with the patience and the firmness of someone who has thought more carefully about the actual situation than the people holding either view, and who has concluded that neither extreme captures the genuine complexity of what is happening and what needs to be done about it. His investment activities during this period extended his influence beyond OpenAI into the broader ecosystem of technology development. He had long been an investor in early-stage companies, using his knowledge of the startup world and his instinct for identifying important ideas early to back founders working on problems that mattered. His investment portfolio spanned a range of sectors, from AI-adjacent companies building applications and infrastructure on top of the models that OpenAI and others were developing, to companies working on the harder, longer-term problems of energy production, biotechnology, and the physical infrastructure of the future. Among the investments that attracted the most attention was his involvement with Helion Energy, a fusion energy startup working on the development of commercial fusion power, the long-sought technology that would provide essentially unlimited clean energy if it could be made to work at commercial scale. Sam had invested in Helion and been closely involved with its development for years, and OpenAI had signed an agreement to purchase electricity from Helion once its technology was operational, a commitment that reflected both Sam's genuine belief in the company's prospects and his broader conviction that the energy demands of advanced AI development made the solution of the energy problem not merely desirable but urgent. The connection between AI and energy was one that Sam had been thinking about and speaking about with increasing directness. The computational requirements of training and running frontier AI systems were enormous and growing, and the electricity demands associated with those requirements were placing real pressure on energy infrastructure in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. Data centers were consuming a growing fraction of global electricity production. The training runs required for the most capable models were consuming amounts of energy that, at scale, would require the expansion of energy generation capacity that only new technologies, nuclear power, fusion, advanced renewable energy systems, could sustainably provide. This was not, for Sam, a problem separate from the AI development mission. It was a dimension of it. The civilization that could develop artificial general intelligence and deploy it in ways that genuinely benefited humanity was a civilization that had also solved its energy challenges, that had abundant, clean, affordable power sufficient to support the computational infrastructure that advanced AI required. The investment in Helion and in other energy technologies was, in this sense, consistent with and connected to the larger vision that had been animating Sam's work since the founding of OpenAI. He was also, in 2024, engaged in conversations and negotiations that reflected OpenAI's growing strategic ambitions in the semiconductor and hardware space. The dependence of AI development on specialized chips, primarily the graphics processing units produced by NVIDIA, whose dominance in AI hardware had made it one of the most valuable companies in the world, was a strategic vulnerability that the major AI developers were working, with varying degrees of urgency, to address. Sam was involved in discussions about developing custom AI chips, about creating the hardware infrastructure that would give OpenAI greater control over the computational resources its research required, and about the broader question of how the supply chain for AI development could be made more resilient and more equitable. The geopolitical dimensions of AI development were also becoming a more prominent feature of his thinking and his public engagement. The competition between the United States and China in AI was real and intensifying, and it was creating pressures that were shaping the policy environment in ways that were not always conducive to the kind of careful, internationally coordinated governance that Sam believed the development of powerful AI required. He was engaged with the policy community on these questions, with the national security establishment, with the State Department, with the intelligence community, trying to ensure that the people responsible for managing the geopolitical dimensions of AI competition understood both the technical realities and the governance possibilities well enough to make decisions that served the long-term interests of humanity rather than merely the short-term interests of any particular nation. Throughout all of this, the commercial management, the research oversight, the investment activity, the policy engagement, the public communication, Sam maintained the quality of presence that had always distinguished his leadership. He was not a person who disappeared into the machinery of management, who became so absorbed in the complexity of running a large organization that the animating convictions that had led him to build it in the first place gradually lost their freshness and their force. He remained, visibly and genuinely, someone who cared about the work, who found the questions at the frontier of AI development genuinely fascinating, who took the responsibilities of his position seriously without allowing their weight to crush the intellectual curiosity and the fundamental optimism that had characterized him since childhood. He was 39 years old. He had spent more than 2 decades building things, building companies, building institutions, building understanding, in service of a conviction that had been forming since a curious 8-year-old boy in St. Louis had first encountered a glowing computer screen and understood, in the wordless way that children understand the things that will matter most to them, that the future was going to be built out of this. Out of the intersection of human intelligence and machine intelligence, out of the conversation between what we are and what we are capable of creating. That conversation was now happening at a scale and with a depth that neither the child in St. Louis nor the 19-year-old who left Stanford nor the 26-year-old who walked into Y Combinator for the first time could have fully imagined. The systems that OpenAI was building were not the endpoint of the story. They were the beginning of its most consequential chapter, the opening movement of something vast and transformative and still, in its essential nature, unwritten. Sam Altman stood at the threshold of that unwritten chapter with a particular combination of qualities that had brought him to this point: the intellectual clarity to see what was coming, the organizational capability to build the institutions required to meet it, the moral seriousness to understand the weight of the responsibility, and the fundamental, unextinguished optimism of the boy from the Midwest who had always believed, against any evidence to the contrary, that the future was something to be shaped rather than merely endured. The machines were thinking. The world was changing. And the man who had done more than almost anyone alive to bring both of those facts into being was waking up each morning, walking into his office and getting back to work. Because the work, as it had always been, was not finished. It was only, and at last truly beginning.